Welcome everyone to 52 Living Ideas. My name is Evanique and I will be your moderator tonight. Tonight we will be studying uh, the Minoan Civilization, the Flowering Goddess, and Penny will be presenting tonight. So I'm going to be doing the presentation. So we're going to split this up in three parts. First, it's going to be the overview, and then Penny's going to talk about, actually, Penny, can you just give us the quick run through? Because I just noted it really quickly.
Right. Yeah, the first one is a general overview of the civilization in Crete and the Minoan civilization. Second part will be more emphasis on the goddess and worship aspects of that in Crete. And the final section is more on the role of women in the society and kind of the end of the goddess culture. So we thought that after each of these sections, we could stop and have a time for a little discussion and then go on to the next section.
Yeah. Thank you, Penny. So I'm going to start by running the presentation. And Penny, you just let me know when you want to move on to the next slide.
Okay, that would be great.
All right, can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
So as we said already, we're studying Minoan Crete, the flowering of the goddess culture. And as we have in all of our presentations so far, mostly we're using the book Goddess Power, Awakening the Wisdom of the Divine Feminine in Your Life by Isabella Price. And so this presentation is primarily based on her work, but I also use some other sources. And if you go to the next page, these are additional books about the goddess culture, and we found them all to be quite good. And so I've used those here. And I also did a list so that people, if they want to look at more books, see it. The History of the Goddess by Edward Dodge, When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone, The Chalice and the Blade by Rian Eisler, and Goddess, The Mysteries of the Feminine Divine by Joseph Campbell. And I could say that there's really only 2 chapters left in the Goddess Power book. So we're thinking probably after we finish that book that we will start with the Joseph Campbell book to continue the series. Okay. So we're studying the Minoan civilization and culture, and the Minoan civilization was really the first great civilization of Europe. And there was this mysterious island that Homer had written about in his Odyssey. And it sounded like such a fantasy, magical land. Like he wrote, out in the dark blue sea, there lies a land called Crete, a rich and lovely land, washed by the waves on every side. And he went on, and everybody at the time thought this was all just purely made up by him, that a place, a society in Crete, like he described, had never happened. And it wasn't till the British archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans in 1900 began to do excavation work in Crete, and he discovered the ancient civilization. And he named it the Minoan civilization after King Minos, who was the most famous legendary king in Crete in the Greek mythologies. And historians and archaeologists think that the civilization probably began about 6,000 BCE. Some have even said as early as 12,000 BCE. And a Neolithic community, agrarian community, migrated from Anatolia. And they brought agriculture and the goddess culture with them, is what they think. And over time, the culture developed. Primarily, it started as agricultural, then they started doing pottery, they did stock breeding, weaving, metallurgy, engraving, And by the 3rd millennium BCE, it was the most technologically advanced and socially complex culture in Europe. And probably the height of the Minoan culture was around 2200 to 1700 BCE. And they call this like the palace era. And they built these lavish palaces, and like Knossos being the most famous one. And they were kind of more like a community center, administrative center, living quarters. The archaeologists called them palaces, but they were not just royal residences. They had political functions, economic functions, and religious functions, and they were very well built. They had perfect drainage systems and sanitary installations. In all the apartments, they had bathrooms. And they had a unique style of architecture. They were built in multi-levels, in an asymmetric design around open courtyards. There was a free flow out to nature. They were very airy and, just expressed a joy in nature and living. And if you go to the next slide, this is an artist rendition of the palace in Knossos. You can see the layout, the courtyards, and some of the rooms were used for storage for agriculture and treasures. Other rooms were royal residences. There were rooms that were like for the courtiers. There were rooms where servants lived, and all of it was very open to nature and very beautifully decorated. And if you go on to the next slide, we'll talk a little more about the modern aspects. Actually, Crete was really a very, very modern society. Even like by today, a lot of the things they had seem incredible. They used the first ceramic water pipes, and they had running water. As we said before, they had bathrooms in all of their apartments. They had the first paved road system in Europe. There were a number of major palace location cities in the island, and they had paved roads with drainage between the different cities. And they even had roadside shelters built so that travelers had a place to stay as they went on their journey. And they had a lot of aqueducts and canals for running water and reservoirs. It was a very rich and wealthy society. And part of that, in addition to all the other things we've already discussed about agriculture and pottery, et cetera, they were really the dominant trade society in Europe at that time. From 2200 to 1450 BCE, the Minoan merchant fleet commanded the Mediterranean trade. It sailed to Greece, to Anatolia, to Phoenicia, to Egypt. They were the prime merchants for tin. They took oil and wool from Crete and exchanged it for manufactured goods. And let me see looking for my notes. And grains, textiles, manufactured goods. They were dominant in the entire Mediterranean region. They also developed two writing systems, the hieroglyphic system and the linear A system. The hieroglyphic system, they can read it, but linear A has never been deciphered. So a lot of the details of their worship and their life, they're not sure if they would be revealed if they can read the linear A. A lot of societies, the initial writings are more like accounting and keeping track of articles, goods, merchants. So they're not sure exactly what is in the linear A, that they haven't been deciphered. And one of the hallmarks of the Minoan culture was their art. They really worshiped beauty, and they had artwork everywhere. And their art and their frescoes depicted natural motifs and that expressed an exuberant joy in all that was alive, and a recognition of our oneness with nature, and ceremonies and rituals that display harmony between men and women who joyfully intermingle as equal participants in life. The palaces were covered with frescoes, and they were on the walls and the ceiling, and they also had art and designs on the floors. So art was everywhere. And the Minoan civilization was really important because it was the last great Bronze Age civilization in which the whole of life was pervaded by an ardent faith in the goddess nature, the source of all creation and harmony. This led to a love of peace, a horror of tyranny, and a respect for the law, and created a social order in which the fear of death was almost obliterated by the ubiquitous joy in living. And these were the words of Nicholas Platon. He was superintendent of antiquities in Crete and one of the archaeologists who did extensive work there. And when we contrast the Minoan Crete with the rest of Old Europe and the Near East, at that time in 4000 BCE, the barbarian herders, often referred to as the Indo-Europeans, from the barren steppes of the north and the deserts of the south, were beginning successive waves of incursion into Old Europe. And they had a male-dominated, hierarchical, war-oriented culture. But Crete was an island in the sea. They were the dominant maritime power. And so they were protected for a couple more centuries by this. And so the goddess worshiping society continued there for a couple of millennium past what it did in most of Europe. The next page. Okay, this is a picture of one of the frescoes from Knossos, and you can see the vibrant, colorful art, the love of nature, the fact that they're close observers of nature, and it looks like a very happy scene with these beautiful fish. And the next picture is, and this is a view, you know, as we said, they were the supreme maritime power. So here we have a picture, we have boats, we have them entering a town, the harbor. We can see people are watching what's going on. And then we can see, you know, the natural wealth and beauty beyond the town, where there's stags and deers leaping and lions chasing them. So they had a very holistic view and a very vibrant and joyful view of life. They were very unique. They were a very peace-loving culture and society. They had a partnership model of society. There was harmony between the men and women, and their society was not based on dominance, destruction, or oppression. The power was based on life growth and representing the interests of the people. The ruling class had no personal ambitions, and they based this on the fact that there are no pictures of rulers, there's no list of what the rulers accomplished, and even all the artwork is unsigned. Nobody has taken, you know, saying, this is mine. It was for everyone, it was for the society. Wealth was very equitably shared. There was some distinctions that, like there was a royal class, their apartments were bigger, and but even the smaller homes were beautiful, well designed, had bathrooms, and had frescoes on the walls and the ceiling. and the royal apartments and things were bigger, but only, slightly bigger. It was still in line with what the other people had. And it was peace loving. This is also based on, there were no military fortifications. So you saw the picture of the palace, very open, everybody can go in. All the major cities in Crete, they had a paved road system. There were no gates. You could walk wherever you wanted. There was nothing stopping you. And even all the buildings and villas that were built on the coast were built without any fortification. There was no depiction of warfare, hunting, weapons, or rulers in the work of the Minoan Cretes. They did have the oldest throne room in Europe. There were two actually in the Knossos Palace. One was more in the private section and one was more in the public section. But they were not big. They were not dominant. They weren't showing that the king was the lord over everybody. And some historians are thinking that the Garden of Eden myth was actually based on society remembering the goddess societies, the agricultural societies. In general, all the Neolithic societies were very similar in that they were partnership societies, they were agrarian based, they tried to make life better for everybody, they were not warlike. So they think, well, maybe that was actually the source of the Garden of Eden myths, were these societies. And if you go to the next slide. This is the throne room in Knossos. You can see it's pretty, it's decorated, but it's a modest room. It is not a room where you're going to walk in and be awestruck by the power of the king. It's kind of a room just like any other one, but there is a throne in it. And it's got symbolism, but it is not a dominant room. And if you want to go on. Okay, and so you kind of like, it sounded like a great place. I mean, when I read it, the more I read about it, it just sounded so wonderful. You're kind of like, well, what happened to the Minoan culture? Well, historians think there were probably two major factors that destroyed the culture: natural catastrophes and foreign domination. And the first, after 1700 BCE, there was a series of earthquakes, tidal waves, and volcanic eruptions. And Crete is prone to earthquakes. So looking at the archaeological record, they could see that there was constant rebuilding and renovating and fixing because of earthquakes. And then in about 1500 BCE, there was an extremely major volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, which is now named as Santorini. And that was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded history. Most of the island of Thera vanished into the sea. And they think that might be the source of the legend of Atlantis, which was the land, out to the west somewhere. And they were putting it now in the Atlantic Ocean, but they think it may have been this, which was in the Mediterranean Sea. At the time, that was extremely far for people. So it was, like a way, way far away land. And some people, historians also postulate that the island of Thera was not only one of the sites. In fact, the Minoan culture had all the Aegean islands, and there were a few locations on the coast, but that it may have been the administrative center for the entire culture. And so when it was destroyed, that was a major blow to the society. And they don't know for sure, but it also could be that it destroyed a lot of their fleet. And so that would also make it difficult for them to recover. And the next volcanic eruption that is not as large as the one they think that was in Thera is the one in Krakatoa in August 26, 1883 in Indonesia. And that one, the scientists estimate that the tsunami caused by it was as high as 900 feet, and that it changed the climate of the world for years afterwards because of all the debris that was thrown into the air. So this clearly could make a point that make it difficult for the society to continue. And the second one was foreign domination, because around 1450 BCE, there are signs in the island that there started to get invasions from the sea. Things had been burnt, things had been destroyed. Crete was eventually conquered by the warlike Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. Historians aren't totally certain if this was just a war, if they married into the royalty, they're not sure, but the Mycenaeans took over and actually became the dominant culture in the Hellenic world at that time. And the Mycenaeans actually adopted a lot of the religious practices of the and cultural practices of the Cretes. And they had the goddess society, a goddess, and they had a matrilineal society with a thaumaturgy. The clothing was very similar. The art was similar, but not as lively. But there were changes. They did have rulers who were men, and they began to have more of an emphasis on death, because in the goddess culture of the Minoans, death was just part of the life cycle. You were born, you lived, and you died, and the goddess took care of you in the entire time. But the Mycenaeans began to have more funeral rites and build, crypts, and put a lot of emphasis on death, which the Crete hadn't. And they also had a writing, since it was similar to the writing from Crete, they named it the Linear B tablets. These have been deciphered, and they've gotten some historical information from them that was very interesting. On the mainland, there was one of the cities was Pylos, and they had got notice that the barbarians were coming. And so they were recording what they were trying to do. And because they also did not have fortifications in the city, they were trying to build a wall. They were melting down any metal objects to try to create more weapons and everything like that. But they were unsuccessful. The barbarians came in, they looted what they wanted, and they burned the city. And the heat reached such a high stage that these clay tablets became stone. And so they've survived to now. And looking at them, one of the things that they found was interesting, that some of them had a list actually of the deities that they were worshiping at that time. And they had the Cretan goddesses, but they also had the Achaean divinities like Zeus, Hera, Athena, Artemis, Hermes, which does show the connection between the later classical Greek and the Cretan mythology. And by 1100 BCE, the barbarian Dorians had conquered the Mycenaean civilization. And both the Dorians and the Mycenaeans are similar people that, were the invaders from the Indo-Europeans. But so anyway, that was the end of the entire cultural period. And this is the next section, more focused on their goddess and their worship. So does anybody have any questions at this point?
If anyone has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat. All right, I'll give it another couple of seconds and then we can move forward. All right. Brian.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So this was really a revelation for me. A couple things that kind of that struck me. A big thing is that this seems to be a separate cultural development, a really flourishing culture, separate and apart from the Sumerian that I've studied, if you will, on my own. Have studied a lot. I'm not an expert in it. So the dates involved here are really go back even further than the Sumerian dates, and it seems to be a completely independent parallel cultural development. So that's really striking, and it piques my interest in this whole development. That's really, really interesting. The second thing is she mentioned that it was probably a Neolithic community that migrated from Anatolia sometime between 12,000 and 6,000 BCE. And that reminded me of the current excavations that are going on right in south central Turkey, really the area that's being hit now by the earthquakes and is very close to Crete. It's a cultural, they've discovered now it's a cultural complex with many, many different settlements. They're calling it Tas Tepeler, but Çatalhöyük is there. You might have heard of that. And Göbekli Tepe and Harappan Tepe. The people are just excavating that now and think that these what they're discovering now in southwest Turkey and Anatolia are the some of the earliest Neolithic developments, the Neolithic settlements. And they sound a lot like what Penny's described societally for the Cretes, except the Cretes have taken it so much further. It's when you look at the excavations there in southwest Turkey, it really looks quite primitive, and what she has shown is very, very modern. It's as beautiful and as modern as Renaissance or Art Deco. It's really, really something. The other thing that struck me is the the peaceful nature. I had heard that before, but it just reminded me in hearing it again that the Harappan culture in India, this Indus Valley civilization, early Indus Valley civilization, was also based on the archaeological discoveries, a very peace-loving society. There were many, many settlements there, probably thicker settlements than in southwest Anatolia, and it's very similar. The archaeological discovery is very similar. Even bigger, very big settlements, but running water, the type of running water that you hear about in Rome at its height. Well, there are some fortifications there, but the belief is there was no war. It's really to me that lends credibility to what Penny's saying about a very peace-loving culture, which in some ways is kind of hard for us to imagine these days. So those are the things that struck me in Penny's presentation.
Thank you, Brian. Up next, I have Joe.
Yeah, I was actually struck as well by the peace-loving culture and actually the relationship with nature. But I want to maybe ask for a little bit more clarification on just the connection between maybe when it became they became or were more focused on death and how that relates to some of the decline of the culture itself at that particular moment in time. I mean, is it becoming more patriarchal at that particular moment in time, and that's starting to manifest itself in different ways, or am I missing the mark on that?
I think that from what they feel, there was a shift in the culture. It, you know, it wasn't a total shift, but it was more male dominated. And the emphasis on death and individual rulers was something that they hadn't seen before. And like there, you know, there's some sarcophagi which are very famous, and there's nothing from the Minoan period at all, because they didn't make elaborate funeral rituals and, you know, try to maintain something that people could see that this person, this particular person had lived, even the rulers. But with the Mycenaeans, then especially the rulers, you know, they wanted to leave something like permanent on earth. And that's an emphasis on death. And they were a more warlike society. So that they did have the goddess, but the goddess started to be more one of the gods, not the goddess who was in charge of everything. And, you know, because they can't read any writing or anything like that, I mean, they look at the architecture, they look at the artwork, and you know, they can see that there's a clear change, and that there is, you know, a drift from the goddess culture as it was before. But wasn't totally complete, because the Mycenaeans did adopt a lot of the Cretan culture, which was probably superior to their culture. They were more warlike, but the Minoan culture was the best, most advanced culture in Europe.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Penny, and thank you, Joe. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? If not, then we will move on to the next part of the presentation.
Okay, and as we said, this is more about the goddess worship and their religious aspects of the Minoan culture. And the goddess was, you know, in the supreme being, and she was the giver and provider of all life and nature. So there was a clear connection between their worship and the natural world, because the goddess was basically the natural world. She provided the natural world to people. And it was really interesting, because the Minoan civilization was the only known Bronze Age civilization where the worship of the goddess survived until historical times. As we said, the other ones, the Indo-Europeans, with their warlike patriarchal culture, came in and were dominating. The religion and entertainment were related. Some people have said it's not even maybe right to say religion, because religion seems like it's kind of a separate aspect of your culture. And for the Minoans, for the Cretans, religion and their life were just integrated. They were together. There was no separation. And their cultural activities and their entertainment were related to the worship. And so they were joyful activities and meaningful. And they centered on the celebration of nature, because of course nature, the goddess, created the world and created nature. And they had public ceremonies. They can tell this from the frescoes. They had frequent public ceremonies. They had processions, there were banquets, there were acrobatic displays. They liked to sing and dance. And then there were the famous bull dances that we'll talk a little bit more about later. The Minoans did have sites for worshiping. In the palaces, there were sites. There were a lot of sites on mountaintops. where they said that were like cosmic pillars where they could connect, heaven and earth connected on the mountaintop. And one of the most sacred mountains in Crete, Mount Juctus, is visible from Knossos. And there they had a major sanctuary up there. They also had found a lot of sanctuary sites in caves. And the caves, a lot of them had passages, they were wet, they were dark, they usually had freshwater sources. And so they were like a symbol of the womb and tomb, because the goddess was the womb that produced the earth. And when you died, you went back to the goddess. So it was the tomb too. And several of these caves, they could tell that they were used for birthing, that people would go in there and they, like hospitals, maternity wards, they would go down into the sacred caves and give birth. And they also had out in nature, they built little rustic shrines by meadows and groves. And I thought it was an interesting quote, the next one. It's from Marija Gamboudas, who was an archaeologist who did a lot of work in Crete, and she's University of California. And she said, shrines of one kind or another are so numerous that there is reason to believe that not only every palace, but every private house was put to some such use. To judge by the frequency of shrines, horns of consecration, and the symbols of the double axe, the whole palace of Knossos must have resembled a sanctuary. Wherever you turn, pillars and symbols remind one of the presence of the goddess. And two other German archaeologists have said something a little similar, Hans Gunther Buchholz and Vaskos Karagiorgis. All the artistic media, in fact, life in its totality as well as death, were deeply entrenched in an all-pervasive, ubiquitous religion centered on the worship of the goddess. And if you go to the next slide. Now we're going to learn a little bit more of the manifestations and symbols of the Minoan goddesses. Here we have one of the best known goddess sculptures. This is one of the snake goddesses. And you can see that she's holding two snakes, one in each hand. And the snake is a symbol of regeneration since Neolithic times, because, the snake sheds its skin and comes back to life. And when you have two snakes like that, then it's usually duality. So life and death are represented because she's holding the two snakes. She has a little cub on her head. And the cub, again, is like the lion, like the bull, is a symbol of the life cycle, like the seed vegetation, where it lives, it dies, and then it's reborn. So these are symbols of the goddess. We see that her skirt is woven. There's an apron, and that's a symbol since Neolithic times. That's the web of life. And the goddess created the web of life. She's the source of the web of life. There are 7 flounces on her skirt, and these represent the 7 days in the lunar quarters. That's time. The moon was associated with the earth, vegetation, because it had a cycle. It came and it died and it was reborn. And so that was very important to them. And so this was a reflection of that cycle. At the same time, they say the goddess was not subject to that cycle. She was eternal. And so here we have the goddess who has the cycle of life, and at the same time, she herself is eternal. And she has an open, her breasts are bare in this outfit. In fact, a lot of the Cretan dresses were like that. And of course, that's a symbol of nurture, because the breast is where the food source comes for life, for young animals. And so they said that the animal, the little cub and the snakes really are reflective of the consciousness in time and space, whereas the goddess herself represents consciousness that isn't tied to time or space, because she is eternal, she is beyond time. And if you were sitting in the lap of the goddess, you would be in time, cradled by eternity, which is a nice thought. And other goddesses that they have found the goddess of the animals and birds, and all animals, both domestic and wild, were sacred. And this later showed up in a lot of the Greek mythology, the Artemis, with the sacredness of life and animals. And she was also, the Cretan goddess was also shown a lot of times with doves. And clearly dove was a symbol that was taken. Aphrodite, it became a symbol of love. It was also taken in the Jewish tradition and became Sophia, wisdom. And even later in Christianity, the dove became the symbol of the Holy Spirit. And another important of the manifestations of the goddess was the goddess of the bees. And the Cretan society seemed to be one of the early ones where they actually had horticulture of bees. And bees were seen as a symbol of regeneration. One of the reasons they felt this was because they would sacrifice a bull, and then bees would come out of the carcass. So they thought the bees were a regeneration of the bull and also the souls of the bull coming out. And the sound that the bees make, that buzzing, zzz, they thought that was the voice of the goddess, the sound that she made when she created the world. And they used honey for rituals and for death rituals. It was turned into mead to create kind of an ecstasy. And people were embalmed with death as a sign of regeneration, because once you died, you would come alive again, because the goddess was going to bring you back to earth. She was also shown guarded by lions and griffins. And the griffins were a sign kind of the totality of the world. It was the bird, lion, and snake. And those were like the three dimensions of the sky, earth, and water. And one of the reasons that they know that the goddess was predominant in the Cretan culture was that in all the artwork they have, there are no prominent male figures. There are some smaller male figures which are worshiping the goddess, but there are no large male figures. And most of the artwork depicts women, much more than men. If you want to go to the next. There's a lot of carryover from the Minoan culture to other cultures. One of the prime examples of this is the Greek oracle at Delphi. And the Mycenaeans, as we knew, took over Crete, and they took the religion back to the Greek mainland. They were the dominant culture there. And as they excavate, they see that, like under Delphi and the Acropolis and many, many other sites, there's Mycenaean ruins. And these are sites of sanctuaries for the goddess and, Gaia, the Mother Earth. In early times, the Delphi oracle, there was a goddess there, and they believe she supplied the divine revelations. She had a priestess who was called Pythia, and she had the snake, which was the python, and she sat on a stool, and on the stool, what her serpent was encircled on the stool that she sat on to make her divinations. And they have determined that the early site was built by women. And so it was entirely, basically a female site honoring the goddess. And later in classical Greece, it continued to be a very important site, continued to be for revelations. but Apollo came and he dominated. And so he was the one in charge of Delphi, and the priestess Pythia just became his helper. And she was called the Delphic bee. Delphi was considered the center of the earth by the classic Greeks, and they had a stone that marked the navel of the earth. It was called the Omphalos stone, and that was shaped like a beehive. And the tombs of the Mycenaeans were also shaped like beehives. And later we see continuation, like with the snake, with Athena. She was associated with a snake, and it was on her sword. In the Acropolis, the Parthenon is built on, a site that was a goddess sanctuary. And next to the Parthenon is a building called the Erechtheum, which is actually the home of her snake. So again, the importance of snakes, and snakes were very important in the revelation process in Delphi and other sites. They were a source of revelation. And another symbol, which was really important, was the Minoan double axe, the labrys. And that's like affiliated with the butterfly. And the butterfly has been a sign of regeneration since Neolithic times, clearly, because, the caterpillar gets in his cocoon and becomes a butterfly. So it's a sign of regeneration. And it's a symbol of transformation in the soul's journey. And the link between those is shown because the Greek word psyche means both soul and butterfly. And Isabella Price felt that the double axe was the supreme emblem of the goddess in her regenerative aspect. And here we have one of the Minoan seals. And we're going to learn just a little bit more of the religious iconography. On the seal, we see in the middle of the seal, there is the famous Minoan double axe. And the double axe also, that was the shape of one of their agricultural tools that they used. And at this point, I could say the Minoans, did have metal. They could work it. They had bronze. But they did not focus on building weapons for war. They built agricultural tools, used it for agricultural tools, and also for a lot of things for worship. So it wasn't that they didn't have metal, they just did not use it for war purposes. So we've got the double axe. To the right, we have the tree of life, which is, in the goddess cultures, the goddess gives life. And so it's a symbol of abundance. It's abundant symbol of what she gives to the world. And on the right side, you see maybe one of her priestesses is gathering the fruit to give to people. There are two priestesses that are coming, or people who are adoring her. And she is greeting them with 3 poppies in her hand. And the poppy was a symbol of regeneration or transformation for in Crete. They grew a lot of poppies, and it has kind of a narcotic effect. So they also thought that in worship, it would create some visions and things like that. The goddess again is cupping one of her breasts, a sign of the nurture that she is going to give to the world and the people who are coming to look at her. At the top, we have the sun and the moon. And the sun is the symbol of the goddess because it doesn't change. It's like eternal. The moon is the symbol of the world that goes through the cycle of life and death with the different stages. So they thought this seal might be kind of showing life and death. Another important symbol was the crescent-shaped bullhorn. And like in many Neolithic societies, the bull, and even later ones, when you know about in the Near East and Middle East, the bull was a symbol of the life force, fertility, potency. It was the male principle, and it was sacrifice was believed to renew the life cycle. Sometimes in Minoan art, it is shown as a young man, the bull, and it was then again a symbol of the vegetative life force subject to the annual death. So the bullhorn has kind of the crescent-shaped bullhorn is one, of course, from the bull, which is the symbol of force, fertility, and at the crescent shape then from the moon shows the cycles of life. And they said that's probably the most prominent symbol in all Minoan civilization. And in the big palace in Knossos, there was a frieze around the edge of the entire palace that had bullhorns. And there were a lot of bullhorns that were made into vessels, rhytons, and they were used for libations, for sacred rituals and things, for pouring it. And these bull's heads have been found in the entire Mediterranean world and in Egypt and beyond, because again, with the trade that the Minoans did. And the sacred axe, the labrys, was used to sacrifice the bull in ceremonies. And that was believed to, of course, to renew the life cycle. The goddess in home shrines, they said, was often portrayed as kind of like a tube, or kind of like she was coming out of the tree of life, being born from it. And then there was a female torso, and she had a crown of poppies on her head. So those were all very common symbols for the Cretans. Yeah. And this is one of the most probably well-known and seems to be one of the most important worship or rituals that they did, was the bull dance. And in the bull dance, young men and women working as teams took turns grabbing the horns of a bull and somersaulting over its back. And in this, the lighter figures are women, and the darker figure on the bull back right now is the man, although both men and women somersaulted. There are other depictions of a similar scene, and that seems to always be the way they represented it. So you knew that there were women and that there were men. They were clear to distinguish because of the colors. And if you want to go to the next slide, we'll just anyway, they felt that this was one of the most singular aspects of the religion, and that this ritual was designed to invoke the divine power to bring well-being to the entire society. One of the things they felt was that maybe they could invoke magical powers with this dance to placate the earth, because they were subject to earthquakes. And so they wanted to make sure that, you know, the goddess, the earth, was happy with them. And if we look at this bull dance and compare it to like the Spanish bull dance, and the Spanish bull dance, they kind of torture the bull, they tease him, they make him run around, and then the matador shows his superiority over the bull by killing him. Where they felt this really was not that type of a thing at all. It was emphasizing nature. It was emphasizing the dancers being in touch with nature. And if they were not in tune with the bull and his movements, they could be killed. So they were adjusting to the rhythm of nature in the ceremony. And the object wasn't then, to conquer the bull or to show they're superior over the bull. And at the end, they did sacrifice the bull with the labrys, the sacred double axe. But that was, a symbol of the goddess's regenerative powers. And they showed a reverence for the animal and also the raw powers of nature. I think that's the next section about women. So if anybody has any questions or comments.
If anyone has any questions or comments, Dave, you raised your hand, so I'll let you go. But if anyone else has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat. David, go ahead. Dave, you're on mute.
He's unable to unmute.
Oh,
Probably.
okay. David, go ahead.
Thank you, my buddy Joe. Yeah, fascinating stuff. I was noticing the skirt with the 7 layers, or what you want to call it, and I was thinking days of the week or whatever. But then you said the 28 days of the lunar cycle, which of course is more obvious. The solar day. The sun goes up, the sun goes down. That's a day. And a primitive man would count, well, that happened 28 times. So the lunar cycle is 28 days. But it just occurred to me, when did we make the connection and divide that in 4 and create the week? I know it's in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the creation was in 7 days. But that's interesting, but it isn't, I don't know, logical. Does anybody have an idea of where in the heck that would have come from? And the other comment I wanted to make was the double-sided axe. Of course, is symmetrical. We think of balance, and what I associate with that is I think it's the Greek god of Janus that has 2 faces facing opposite directions, which is the first month of the year. Looking back and looking forward, to me, is a very special symbol. But anyway, those are things that occur to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Penny, do you want to respond?
I'm not sure when they created the 7 days, but there is the cycle of the moon, and
Oh, and also, is
stages.
it all associated with the 28-day woman's menstrual cycle?
Does anybody else know about the 7 days?
I'm not quite sure I understood the question fully. Dave, do you want to rephrase?
Well, as I said, a lunar cycle is 28 days, but the skirt has 7 layers, which I associate with the 7 days of the week. But how did we get from 28 days to 7 days? I don't. Anyway, that was my question.
If anybody else has an answer to that question, you can feel free to type exclamation point. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to Brian and Joe. Brian, you're up.
As it's gone quiet, can I interject? If Anique, we can't hear you now. You're mute.
Let me check. Brian, did you want to say something?
I'm just going to answer Dave's question about 7 days.
Oh, go ahead.
So I think it's, I'm probably wrong. I think it's to do with the fact that back in the olden days, they saw 7 planets and they named the days of the week after the 7 planets, which obviously therefore created a cycle because they repeated it every 7 days. I think that's, I'm probably wrong, but that's what I remember.
I think that's a good explanation. I'm not going to doubt you. Brian, did you want to say something? No? Okay. Oh, wait.
Okay, there. The yeah, the only thing I'd add to the explanation is that again, from a totally different perspective, the Sumerians and the Babylonians did work on the skies and the cosmic aspects of nature that really were, I think, evolved a little bit after the focus on terrestrial nature. They started focusing on the rhythms of the skies, but again, at a very early date, because it's important for agricultural reasons. And they used a base 6 for everything. So they divided 360 degrees, and I can't recite on it right now, but they had things organized in groups of 6. And I honestly, beyond that, I don't know, except that in the Jewish Bible they added that 7th day to rest. And if that was the first of the references to 7, I don't know. Maybe that Jewish practice came out of an even earlier practice. The certainly 28 is divided evenly by 4 and gives you 7. So maybe there was just an understanding, or people saw a point or a purpose in proceeding in that way. The more broadly, what strikes me, and I'm not sure, I have no idea how these things are connected, but wow, the tie-ins between the iconography that Penny presented and other iconography and symbols in the Middle East is really striking. I don't know that much about symbols in old Europe preceding the Greeks, but the in Çatalhöyük and in this early Anatolian civilization that's just now being researched, really since World War II is being researched. And by the way, right now that dates back to about 12,000 to 10,000 BCE. So it's really ties in with the start of this Cretan civilization. They don't have a lot of interior decor, but you can see some of it. They plastered their walls white with a limestone. They tend to build on limestone outcroppings, and they had birds they painted birds with a black substance, and also which to me seemed like vultures. And they painted, they had other animals as well in their iconography. But the key thing here is that their interior decor was dominated by bull horns. And it's kind of interesting. There was if you will, kind of it seems, if you will, if we were using our frame of mind, they lived in 1 or 2 rooms that they tended to get into from the roof because they would build next to each other. And there was 1/4 of, let's say more than 1/4 of it, but 1 corner was elevated a bit, set aside with a ridge, and on that ridge were horns, big bull horns. can't really tell you if they were real or not, but I think they must have been, because it'd be very hard to, I think, to fashion those out of ceramics or some other substance. In any event, that's also where they buried people. They buried their dead under the floors where they lived. So this life and death, the theme comes up a lot. Vultures tie in with the life and death, but the bull, that really struck me when Penny was talking, the connection there, especially the idea that possibly the Cretans emigrated from Anatolia. I will say there's also mythology in the Sumerians, very early Sumerian civilization, that the goddess brought agriculture down into Sumeria, which is at the mouth of the Tigris Euphrates, and that it came down from the mountains, and that would be the Tigris and Euphrates began right up there where the that cultural complex now is being excavated. So it's really striking that the idea of the goddess worship, Penny mentioned worshiping on high places, that appeared both in the Sumerian and possibly the Cretan, and in the Cretan context. Maybe both of them are hearkening back to this remembrance of the agriculture that was brought out of southern Anatolia. The other thing that strikes me is a mashup, kind of what I would call in the Garden of Eden, a mashup of this iconography, a reorientation and a reinterpretation, presentation of this iconography that Penny presented from the medallion. That was really interesting to me, because there, and it makes perfect sense, you've got the goddesses, in the understanding of the Minoans makes perfect sense. The goddess is presenting the fruit, the food to man, and she's nurturing them and feeding them. And then you also have the intuitive element of the goddess, which kind of now is making sense to me based on what Penny said, that the goddess is consciousness outside of space and time, but can manifest itself in space and time through things like the dove, or the snake, which seems to be also tied in with divination. So since the goddess is consciousness outside of time and space, she could foresee the future. But if you call upon her, she can tell you what's going on, what's going to happen in the future through divination, by becoming immanent in the here and now. So in effect, she sees into the future. And that kind of that makes sense to me. That's another aspect of the goddess. But in the Garden of Eden, you have these two things mixed together, the goddess giving the fruit to mankind is now tied in with the knowledge of good and evil. So it's all become very moralistic, if you will, and it loses its original meaning. Instead of the snake helping you to tell the future, it leads you away from God, its knowledge and its wisdom, its insight, or leaving its higher intelligence, if you will, or leading humanity away from God. And the fruit is the vehicle through which that is done. So it's really it's using the same symbols, but in a very, very different way. The Jewish tradition is very patriarchal. And so all of the good parts of the goddess tradition, the food is nurturing and the snake is helping to foresee the future, are seem to have been changed into and presented in a very derogatory fashion. That's just what strikes me. There's beyond that, there's so in this presentation on the symbols and the iconography, there's so many tie-ins with what's going on generally that it's really, really fascinating. That's all I've got right now.
Penny, you wanted to respond?
Oh, I just wanted to, I consulted, as we do in modern times, because I'm, not that big on the lunar cycle. But I mean, they talk about the 4 phases. Each month, the moon goes through its 4 phases: new moon, first quarter, full moon, and third quarter. And another way they kind of talk about it is here, where they mention that the 2 halves are the 2 waxing and waning halves of the cycle. So it's easy where they came up with the 7 days, because, the cycle itself is divided into these 4 parts of 7 days, and where they became a week, that I don't know. But the fact that the 7 was very obvious, because that's one phase in the moon cycle.
Thank you, Penny. One thing I just wanted to add to when Brian was talking about the Garden of Eden, I was thinking of the snake. And I said, you know what? I said, you could definitely see the Minoan culture in that, because the snake revealed good and evil, right? The snake was revelatory in that it revealed, I think in a sense, it revealed what humanity is in the mix of it, and that we can encompass good and evil, and I think something this snake said too is that you will become like God. Well, in the New Testament, it talks about, Jesus talks about us being gods because we have God in us. So I think in a sense, the snake was very revelatory. So it was true to its nature. Now, it was also given, it was also given an evil connotation by Judaism and, Christianity as well. But I think if you look at it, it did do its job, and even, and the simple fact, like Brian was talking about, the goddess giving fruit and Eve giving Adam the fruit to eat, and the nurturing aspect. You do see that in there. It's just, I guess in the Jewish culture, it just, I don't want to say it got twisted, but that's the best way I can describe it, is that it got twisted a little bit. So I just thought of that, and I think it's wild to me that the only place where the snake is evil is in the Christian Bible and in the Torah, right? That's in Jewish culture, is that's the only place where the snake is evil. But in other senses, it's like the partner of the goddess. So I guess kind of like, if you are trying to have a male dominant society, you would have to, in a sense, demonize the snake and also demonize the female, and having the female listen to the snake and then influence the male. So those are just some of my thoughts. But I know we have a lineup. So up next, I have Joe, Nalini, Martha, DLJ, and Brian again.
Actually, I think my comments, I'm going to hold off because I think my comments are going to be more relevant even to the next section, specifically that the positions that women held and the economic status and the educational status of women in that culture. So I think that's where I'm going to go, and I'll try and link it back to this section. But so I'll hold off on my comments. But thank you for everyone's comments, and thank you, Penny. This is a great presentation thus far.
Thank you, Joe. And just whenever you're ready, type exclamation point again, just so I'll know to call on you. Up next, I have Nalini. Thank you for waiting.
Oh, thank you. I just was going to talk about a little bit what I found, and it's from the Encyclopedia Britannica about the week. So according to them, the period of 7 days, week, it's a unit of time artificially devised with no astronomical basis. The week's origin is generally associated with the ancient Jews and the biblical account of the creation. But then evidence, further, they say evidence indicates, before that, biblical account of the creation according to which God labored for 6 days and rested on the seventh. However, evidence indicates that the Jews may have borrowed the idea of the week from Mesopotamia or Sumerians. And I think that's what DLJ had mentioned. For this, the Sumerians and the Babylonians divided the year into weeks of 7 days each, with one of which they designed a day of creation. The Babylonians named each of the days after one of the 5 planetary bodies known to them: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and after the Sunday and the moon, a custom later adopted by Romans. And then it goes on. It also talks about, for centuries, the Romans used a period of 8 days in civil practice, but in 321 CE, Emperor Constantine established the 7-day week in the Roman calendar and designated Sunday as the first day of the week. So just wanted to let you know, that's what.
Thank you so much, Nalini. That added a great part to the conversation. Up next, I have DLJ, Martha, and Brian.
Well, actually, I put my exclamation mark in to answer Dave's question, but no, since I've got a moment, you mentioned snakes, Jewish and Christian. Don't forget the Norse. The Norse have got a wonderful story about Jormungand, I think it's pronounced, which is the snake that holds up the earth and was put under by Odin or whatever. So I think he was a baddie as well, that snake. So that's fun to read. That's all.
Thank you. Up next, I have Martha, followed by Brian.
I was just going to mention that the 7-day week comes from the Babylonian calendar, which has already been mentioned. So that's the only thing I had to add.
Thank you so much, Martha. Up next, I have Brian.
Oh, that's it. That's all interesting. How do we get the 7 days onto that skirt of the Minoan goddess from Babylonia? I think the Babylonians happened later. But so are we referring to the weeks? It seems that would refer to a week. And I think the Babylonians, they studied the cosmic a lot. So I think what Penny said makes sense. You know, you have the 28 days that clearly you can divide it into half by the waxing and waning. And they went a little further, I think, and divided that again. And maybe both of those things originate from a more recent, a later date. But the Babylonians came at a much later date than this, what we've been talking about here. So or at least, I would say they came later, the Neo-Babylonians. And but the thing I wanted to go off on was the temples and the openness to nature, and using trees and columns. Columns are often seen as an archetype or a symbolic representation of the tree. And that's also picked up in the Middle East, in the Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, Phoenician, Hebrew traditions. Any place that had the goddess had a pole for the worship of the goddess. And people have already flagged that it's a connecting heaven and earth. And that's true. I think it's also the other aspect of it is the one that Penny has mentioned a couple times, rather more than once, more than twice, the importance of the goddess as representation, the source of nature. She talked about in Crete that worship being on high places. That's also exactly how the goddesses were worshipped in the Middle East. The high places in Mesopotamia were built on the ziggurats, but where you had the hills, you had orchards, trees, and poles that were put up to celebrate the goddess. The thing that strikes me is the difference between, and here I want to stress the horizontal, the openness to nature, not the vertical. A pole is open to nature on all sides, and it's especially from a high vantage point, you really can appreciate and worship nature itself. That contrasts, I think, dramatically with the kind of temples that are built by the fortress temples that were built by the Jews and other patriarchal religions, where it's all enclosed and cut off from nature. Some people say it's much more of a societal. These patriarchal religions are much more of a societal based religion with a patriarchal model of society, much more a societal vision of religion than a natural vision. And I think that's captured in the different places where the worship occurred. At a pole on the top of a hill, or even at a tree on the top of a hill, is very open to nature. A temple in the middle of the city is not. So again, I'm just going off on there's so many great symbols in what Penny presented. I'm just going off on another one and kind of emphasizing how important the structure of the place of worship was in the significance of the goddess. And I'm contrasting that to the vision and significance of gods.
Thank you, Brian. Up next, I have Dave from Tacoma.
Yeah, thanks. And not to beat this to death, but I'm thinking now, is the moon only visible 14 days of the 28 because the position of the sun and the moon, it's on the opposite side? And so this visible 14 days, 7 days it's getting bigger and 7 days it's getting smaller. I see that. I guess that's where things are coming from, and that is obvious. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Dave. Penny, whenever you're ready, we can go back to the presentation.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right. All right.
Okay. And I'll just say there is a little bit more about the the whole story of the Garden of Eden and stuff at the end of this presentation and its links. So in a society that has a female deity, worships the goddess, how are women treated? And from what they could see from all of the artwork, the frescoes, the things that are recorded on seals and stuff, women enjoyed a very high social, economic, political, and religious position in Crete. They were active participants in trade, the arts, priestesses, midwives, and healers. They really participated in all aspects of life. And there was, as we said, though, a partnership relationship with men, not a dominant relationship. The society itself had a very open-minded attitude towards sexuality. We've seen in the goddess, the seal, and in the goddess statue, you know, clothing that revealed the breast. This was also commonly worn by women. The clothing was very beautiful and did not inhibit your movements and emphasized sexuality. The men's clothing was also the same. It was very scanty and revealed the men's genitals. And they felt that this was a society that saw the differences in male and female and took pleasure in it and what it would bring to life. So there was no shame in your sexuality. And they felt that this created a much more a society without some, you know, so many problems as we have today, because sex was just part of life, and celebrating, you know, sexuality was part of life. There was very uninhibited interaction between the sexes. You can see, like in the bull dance, the performers were scantily dressed. There was a lot of acrobats and exercise in the Crete society. Both men and women did it. And, you know, they dressed with very little clothing to be able to participate in these activities. The society was matrilineal, with succession and inheritance passed through the female line, which is very common in almost all the Neolithic societies. And as we have said, there's a lot of continuity between the Neolithic societies that were goddess worshippers and the Minoan society, which continued to be a goddess worship society, even though it was in the Bronze Age and lasted until the historical times. And people say, oh, okay, well, if women seem to be kind of be in charge in the Minoan society, was this like a matriarchy? And were there like queen and priestesses that ruled? And I would say, I mean, pretty much all historians and archaeologists say, no, that's not the case. Because we had a society where the goddess was supreme, and it was matrilineal, and women had a very high status and participated in all aspects of life, but they were not dominant. Men were not inferior. It was a partnership model of society, and it was focused on the power that gives. And the wealth in the society was used to help everybody in the society, which is seen by the many innovations they had, where they had, you know, indoor plumbing, they had running water, they had a paved highway system. All the houses were beautiful and decorated, and, you know, nobody, as we said, the artwork wasn't signed. They didn't leave records of the rulers. And that's one way. They actually don't know if there was a queen in Minoan Crete, because they didn't give any records of the rulers. So it appeared, because of the high status of women, that it's possible that there were queens, but they didn't know. And when we look at patriarchy, a patriarchal society is really based on domination. there are hierarchies. There's a class structure. They often had a lot of slaves which were in the lowest position, which weren't even treated basically like they were humans. They were subhuman. And in these societies, men ruled through control of the military, through force. And warfare was very important. There was a focus on destruction and on the power that takes. And instead of using the resources of the society to try to improve the lot of everyone in the society, in a lot of these societies, they focused on building weapons, going someplace else, taking from the other people the things that they wanted, and destroying the rest because they didn't care about the people that they conquered. And so the Minoan society, even if women were the queens, was not a patriarchal society, because it wasn't focused on weapons, it wasn't focused on domination, it wasn't focused on a hierarchy of, you know, here's the people who are important and here's the people who aren't important. So it was definitely not a matriarchal society. They do call it sometimes pre-patriarchal, because all the societies before the patriarchal, which is at the present type still the dominant type model of society in the world, is you know, they started out as being matrilineal and more female focused. And the next slide. Oh, and one of the most famous stories from Greek mythology, and especially regarding Crete, is the famous story of the labyrinth and the Minotaur. And so we kind of wanted to look at what did the labyrinth mean for the people in Minoa and Minoan Crete, and what did it mean for the Greeks? And for the Minoan culture, the labyrinth was an ancient, contemplative, and transformational tool that represented the path to our innermost being, the center. And the labyrinth, the word itself comes from the same word as labrys, which is the double axe. So those have the same root. So actually the labyrinth is the house of the double axe. And as we know, the double axe is a symbol of the goddess. So the labyrinth was the temple of the goddess. And it was a place where her mysteries could be celebrated and made known, in a place of spiritual rebirth. And the labyrinth was an important symbol for the Minoan Cretes. There was a labyrinth drawn on the ground floor, a quarter in the Knossos Palace, and also in one of the Agia Triada Palace. And it was depicted on coins and on seals. And the palace that was drawn on the Knossos Palace actually had 7 circuits that led to the inside. Again, we have the 7 as the number I think that they think is important with the lunar cycles and time, a clear division of time in their mind. And there is, though, for the labyrinth is not a maze. A maze is a structure that in some ways resembles a labyrinth, but there are dead ends. You can get lost, you can get stuck. A labyrinth, although it has twists and turns, has a clear path always toward the center. And so it's representative of the spiritual journey. And the journey is not a straight path. There's going to be twists and turns in the path as you go on your spiritual life, but it's going to take you to the center, to the goddess, to your soul. And you're not going to get stuck in some dead end like a maze. So it was kind of interesting. How did the labyrinth, which is basically considered kind of the holy of holies for the Minoans, how did that become this abode of the Minotaur, who was this horrible creature with the head of a bull and the man of a body who ate people? Do you want to do the next? Okay. So, and this refers a little bit back to the conversation that you were having before about the Adam and Eden myth and stuff. They feel that classical Greek mythology basically slayed the goddess. And these were patriarchal takeover myths. So in the Minotaur, we have Athens being a tribute state that was ruled by Crete at the time. And so they had to send tribute. And what was required is that every year they had to send 7 beautiful maidens and 7 beautiful youth that the Minotaur could eat. And the Minotaur was kept in this dark labyrinth below the palace of Knossos. And so the son of the prince, Theseus, said that he would go and slay the Minotaur and free the Athenian people. And so the story is he arrives, and Ariadne, who is the daughter of Prince Minos, sees him, instantly falls in love, and decides to help him in his quest. And so she gives him a double axe, the double axe sword, and a ball of string. And that way he can go in, slay the Minotaur, and get out of the labyrinth. And so today they're usually say that this is the archetypal hero's quest, where the man is going into the darkness, into the wilderness, and he's slaying the god of death and freeing his people. Or that, it's the journey into the depths of the unknown dimensions of the psyche. And at the end, you find your treasure that ends it all. And Ariadne shows female intuition, and the fact that with this thread symbolizes the intuition that can help you get through the journey to your soul, the psyche. But if you look at it another way, this is a death blow to the goddess, because they have turned the labyrinth, which is the holy of holies, a way to reach the goddess, and they have turned that into like a chamber of death. And Theseus killed the Minotaur with a double axe, again a symbol of the goddess. And so he has gone into the goddess's womb and converted her sanctuary into a kingdom of death, and he separated death from the life cycle. So death is no longer part of the whole cycle of life and death that the goddess was in charge of. Now, death is separate. Death is an ending, which isn't followed then by the regeneration that the goddess represented. So this is, they feel that the Greeks, as you were saying before, have taken kind of a spin on it to make their culture the one that is superior. And they did that with a lot of other myths. Another one that was very famous was the Delphi myths, where we had, of course, the oracular goddesses and the snake that was Python, that was her companion and a source of the revelations from the goddess. And so in the Greek mythology, Apollo arrives at Delphi, and there's a horrible female snake, and she's bringing a lot of evils on the world, even though they also say she's the guardian of the shrine of Mother Earth. Anyway, and so he slays her and frees the world from the horrible female snake. And it's similar to the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish. And in that, the solar hero god of Marduk kills Tiamat. Tiamat was the dragon serpent goddess of primordial chaos and watery abyss. So she was the source of creation, the water from which creation came. And again, in this myth, they have turned her into something evil. So she's evil, and the wonderful sun god, Marduk, kills her. And in this case, which is something they also did, the sun used to be the sign of the goddess because she was eternal and unchanging. And in the patriarchal myths, they took the sun for their hero. It became the symbol of their hero, the masculine hero, and not the goddess. And then they also mentioned, as you guys were saying, which is very similar, I mean, you already saw that, the Adam and Eve myth, that the express purpose of that was to denigrate the ancient goddess, because goddess culture in Canaan was very strong. The people had been worshiping for thousands of years, and they didn't want to give it up. The women didn't want to give it up. And the priests wanted to impose their one male deity, a very patriarchic-based society. And they were having a very hard time doing it. So there are two creation stories in the Bible. And so they wrote a new creation story, and the Garden of Eden. So they created where Adam was created first, and then Eve was taken out of his rib. So they have taken birth away from females, from women. Men now give birth. Adam gave birth. And then they had the story of the garden, and the serpent, again, was the source of evil. Instead of being the symbol as the goddess of good, he was evil. And the tree, instead of being the tree of life, was the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and basically sexual consciousness. And Eve takes the fruit and gives it to Adam, and has become a sexual temptress, and bringing the downfall of all of humanity, the expulsion from the garden. And to top it off, then God awarded man the divine right to dominate woman. And there are many, many examples of this. One is Pandora's box again, that the female goddess gave all the gifts, all the wonderful things to mankind. And in Pandora, she opens the jar and lets out all the evil in the world. And one that Brian had discussed about the end of the goddess worship was when Zeus, he killed the goddess Metis, who was wisdom, and the warrior goddess Athena was born out of his head. And so again, birth does not come from women, life does not come from women, it comes from men. And so there were really, all of these classical Greek myths were trying to support patriarchal society, to show that that was what had brought good things to the world, that they were the ones who conquered evil with force. And but on the other hand, then they were slaying the goddess, who was the source of life, in the previous cultures. That's the end of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Penny. Like, this was really, I knew it was going to be great, but you know, it was really great and really awesome. So thank you so much. I know you put in so much work in this, and I just wanted to just say thank you. I really appreciate it. Some of the thoughts that I had, especially during that last part, and I looked at creation and I looked at chaos being, part of creation. It in patriarchal society, it was almost painted as evil, right? Um, but my question is why? I mean, like, I guess why. I know kind of like the reason why the demonization of women had to happen, because men wanted the power, and women, and people were not willing to give up their goddesses. Um, but I just wonder symbolically, like, you know, and this is not, this is a question for everybody. Like, I guess why? Like, why the need to dominate? Um, I guess that's just a general question. And I thought of another person um, in Jewish mythology, Lilith, who was actually supposedly the first wife of Adam, but wouldn't submit to Adam. So they kind of made her into a demon-like character because she wouldn't submit to Adam, and they said she ran away, and that's when Eve came. Something to study in the future, but just thank you so much. So many thoughts, so many things to think about. And thank you for presenting the divine feminine in this way and showing the beauty of it in the art, and you know um all of the symbolism of the goddess, and showing us different ways to look at different myths and symbols. So thank you. Sorry, I forgot my speech. If anyone has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat. Joe, you're up.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment. And I also want to thank you, Penny. That was a fabulous presentation, and actually really eye-opening. What I'm actually struck is by the parallels that can be drawn even in today's world, in the sense that this reliance on the masculine and how it leads to a focus on developing weapons and actually less on kind of social issues that actually that promote harmony. It's kind of interesting, and I couldn't help but think this whole time. I kept thinking about the Tao, the balance between feminine and masculine, and when there is balance, there is harmony, and when it's out of balance, then you kind of see this disparity that starts to emerge, and a leaning towards domination, and a focus on dominating not only women in the culture, but also dominating other countries, so that it leads towards to our own demise. So that's what has really struck me. That was interesting to me, that the position that women had held in society at that particular moment in time. It's amazing to see how we've backslid so far, where women were in positions of power economically, and with trade and education. And even though it didn't specifically say education, but and how that parallels also with the sexuality aspect of things, and how people were more open with their own sexuality at the particular moment in time, and how there was actually an appreciation for the feminine when there was more an open society when it came to sexuality. So I'm looking over this chapter and having the context that you've now provided, I very much appreciate it. And thank you for this presentation this evening. It was fabulous. I really do. I mean, the past couple of presentations that both you and Brian have done have been nothing short of fabulous.
Thank you, Joe. Up next, I have Dave from Tacoma.
Yeah, thanks again, Penny. It was wonderful. I'm looking forward to, I think you said you're going to do a Joseph Campbell next, because I remember the Joseph Campbell series on TV, gosh, about 50 years ago. But he was famous for looking back into these old mythologies and talked about them. And yeah, this stuff is just so fascinating about our history. I think growing up in the Christian church, the Bible is everything. No, there's just so much more that's so interesting to study. So I'll be looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. One thing I just want to say one more thing. Like, one thing that I did notice is that how much culture that the Bible took from all of these different I don't want to say religions, but cultures. I'll just say cultures. And you can see this symbolism used in the Bible. It may not have been used the way the originators intended it to be, but I think you can definitely see the influence, and you can see where it's been, like, even though, I feel like sometimes, like, the people who put the Bible together and put these writings together were trying to show the dominance of the male. But when you study all of these different cultures, and what you've done tonight, especially Penny, is bring to light is that how much they took even the stories from different religions and put it in the Bible. And so, again, Penny, I can't say it enough. Excellent, excellent job. But up next, I have Martha, followed by Joe.
Thank you, Pete, for your presentation. It was really good. It's been a long time since I've studied the Minoan civilization. There's actually been more things come to light about them since that time. So it was enlightening. One thing that I wanted to address is Ivanique's question about why it was that men felt the need to, begin to dominate women in culture. And I think it's probably a very complicated issue, but just thinking in primitive ways, mankind from its beginnings would have obviously seen that life came from women, whether they associated men as having a part in that or not is questionable in the really early parts of humanity. Later on, yes, it's obvious from the Greeks that at least understood that men played a part in that. But that's a tremendous power. And I think that's the reason why you see ancient, much more ancient cultures than the historical era, having egalitarian views about men and women in a more balanced way, and they see women as being the power, having the power of bringing life into the world, and that's something that the men could never achieve. It was something, and men being geared towards they tend to be more I think that they almost were threatened by that idea that all things came, all humanity came from women, and they wanted to somehow circumvent that power that they didn't have and come up in a mythological way, a way that things also came from men. And I think that's why you started seeing these myths of male gods with women figures coming from them, and on into the Bible story where woman came out of man instead of being created in equal footing with men, as the original story of creation in the Bible presents it. And that's just my thought. And oddly enough, in a culture that's predominantly balanced between the sexes, where there's a focus on peace and there's not a lot of warfare, I think that kind of gave rise to men wanting something to do that was significant, something just as powerful as the life-giving properties that women had. And unfortunately, that was death-giving properties of warfare. And you see that played out. Granted, all people came from women in their view, but men had the power to take that life away. And they unfortunately used that. And that's kind of how we get the patriarchal model of society that we have now. In my opinion, I think that had a lot to do with it. And one thing that struck me is there have been matriarchal cultures throughout the world that did not have a goddess theology, but yet developed in different ways. It fascinates me that the Minoans were so egalitarian and that women didn't dominate the men. You do see other cultures that didn't have a goddess as the supreme being, who the women did actually kind of dominate the men in many respects. From my own culture, I think of the Cherokee, they were very matriarchal. The women owned and controlled everything. Men had no property, basically. He had maybe a few personal possessions. If his wife didn't like him anymore, she could set him outside his door and he had no say-so in the matter. It was over. And she actually had the power of life and death over her own offspring, and women had power over the entire tribe. The men had councils and they would decide if they wanted to go to war, but all it took was the women to just say, nope, we're not going to do that. And that was over. Any decision the men came to had to ultimately be okayed by the women's council, because they were seen as the mothers of the entire nation, and they had the ultimate say in any instance of life or death regarding any of the tribal members. But yet they did not have a goddess as a supreme being. It was more of a genderless spirit concept, similar to what you see in Christianity. But anyway, the differences between how it plays out when there's a goddess in charge as opposed to just a matriarchal society is intriguing to me. That's all I had to say.
Thank you very much, Martha, for those thoughts. Some very interesting points to think about. So up next, I have Joe.
Basically, I forgot to thank you, Evan, actually, for all the presentations that you did as well. So I wanted to apologize for that. But I did want to address actually your comment, your question, just a bit, and not in any kind of length of detail. But I do believe that social status has actually something to do with the idea of the masculine starting to dominate the feminine, where people start to focus less on the community, maybe in harmony of the society, and they start to focus more on again dominating, whether it be again internally or externally. I think that then there's a status factor that comes into play with that, and that the masculine personality essentially comes out in that environment. So that there's, and I think that that's a product more of modern society than anything else. In certain cases, this is one of those instances where we can learn from what are perceived to be more primitive cultures.
Thank you so much, Joe. And no apologies necessary. Penny and Brian did a great job, and they did some real research. So no worries. Penny, any final thoughts?
Yeah. Oh, I was just going to say something in your question, and just a little bit too. But I mean, two of the things that I have read is that a lot of it, had to do with societies in which there was herding and raising animals, rather than agrarian societies where you're much more tied to the earth and what happens in the earth. That in the herding societies, there was more a feeling of, these are my animals and I'll take them wherever I want. And they're not looking at the earth as this, in the same way, like the source of life, but just, food for their animals. And that they seem to be some of the first patriarchal societies. And the other thing I have read too was that it became clear that when men wanted to make sure they knew who their children were, because they didn't want to raise anybody else's kids. They wanted their children to be their children and, inherit their wealth. And the only way they could do that was to control women. Because if the woman went with anybody else, they could never be certain that it was their child. So they had to make sure that women were their possessions and that they had no freedom outside their home. And the Jewish people I have read were particularly concerned about that because of the matrilineal societies and the goddess worshiping societies where they were fighting to become dominant.
Thank you so much for that, Penny. When you said that, I thought of, when you were talking about the herding especially, I was thinking of the indigenous people in North America, the Native Americans, and their idea of, they didn't really have this idea of ownership of land. It was just land. It was land that God gave to everybody. And, the resources of the land were for everybody. So they didn't have this concept of ownership as we do. It was just kind of like it just belonged to everybody. Like, this is God's land. I don't have any ownership over it, and neither does anybody else. And I just think that's beautiful. And I think in future iterations, I would love to study that culture, because I know they have, you know, they have a society where, both sexes are respected and loved. And, there was a respect for females in their role and males in their general roles. And, so it would be a great thing to study. You just sparked that when you said that. So thank you. So if no one else has any questions or comments, I'm just going to really quickly go over some upcoming events that's coming up this weekend. Just pulling it up. So on tomorrow at 1 p.m. there's a meetup called A Shortcut to Understanding Effective Neuroscience with Lucy Biven. She wrote a book, which is the name of the meetup, A Shortcut to Understanding Effective Neuroscience. And from what I read, it's just bringing neuroscience down to a level for people like me that don't understand neuroscience. So that will be Saturday at 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. And then on Sunday, we have I can never say this name, Gus Faust, a treasure trove of poetic and philosophic insight and inspiration. And that's being led by Phil and that is Sunday at 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. And then on Sunday night, we have our Bucky series continuing, and it's key cinematic Bucky themes with Christopher Zeloff. And that will be Sunday, February 12th from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. So feel free to look more on 52 Living Ideas for other events that are coming up this week. But I just wanted to bring your attention to those things that are happening this weekend. So I just want to thank you again, once again, Penny. Thank you so much for a beautiful, wonderful presentation. Amazing. I'm going to go back and go over those slides again because, oh my gosh, awesome. And thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for your comments and your questions and your insights. It is all appreciated. We always appreciate when people participate. It just makes the presentation richer. So thank you everyone for your questions and comments. And with that, have a great evening, everyone. Good night.
Hi.
Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Have a good night.
Penny.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Thank you so much.
See you all soon. Thank you.
Good
Yes.
night.